Welcome to the 179th Legal Empowerment Through Interaction lecture series. The journey of empowerment, interaction, rather even fellowship continues. Today we have a wonderful speaker, thanks to Nima. He is Professor Manoj Kumar Sinha. He is the director of the Indian Law Institute, New Delhi. We are privileged with the presence of Justice Ramkumar sir, Justice Ramakrishnan sir, and all of you wonderful participants who have been part and parcel of this journey of discovery of the nuances of law. Sir, this being a completely informal platform wherein we only deal with the matter and issue, directly over to you, sir, Professor Manoj Kumar Sinha, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Honorable Justice Ramakrishnan Krishna Iyer, sir, Honorable Justice Ram Kumar, Sri S.K. Prem Raj Menon, Syam Padam, and Raghu Kumar, and all others present here. So today I'm part of the 179th lecture, and I think this itself is a record in India for the webinar. If I consider it's a part of 179, I don't think any institution has conducted so much webinar in starting from the month of March 2020 and today. I also like to thank Nima because Nima has brought Prem Kumarji to Premrajji to my place, and I'm thankful that Premrajji thought about I should come and share some of my thought on the refugee law. And when we talk about the refugee law as a topic has been identified, it's a two broad perspectives like refugee law in national and international law. And when we talk about the national, we don't find anything directly dealing with the refugee law in India. What we have Passport Act, we have Foreigners Registration Act, we have main law, if I consider, that is the Foreigners Act of 1946. The first law which I consider where we have some kind of who are foreigners, who are aliens, and whether refugee has been defined. But when we look into the Foreigners Act of 1946, there are three important sections. It's not a big act. It has many sections, but there are three important sections. The first is the Section 2 of the Foreigners Act, which simply says foreigner means a person who is not a citizen of India. I mean, anybody who enters. So we have not defined refugee as such, but it says anybody who is not citizen is a foreigner. So refugee, we have to look into that particular definition of the Section 2 of the Foreigners Act. So this is one. Then the second is Section 3, which gives abundance power to the central government. Central government has complete control about the foreign national, even if a foreign national enters in the Kerala or West Bengal or any other state, they will be governed by the Foreigners Act, and largely central government has say. It's not the state government, central government has complete, and Foreigners Act. So it means prohibition, regulations, restriction, deportation under Section 3, all aspects are covered under the Section 3 of the Foreigners Act. So Section 3 gives again power to the central government to regulate, to prohibit, to restrict the movement of the foreigners, and also deportation of the foreigner is there. And then the next is Section 14 of the Foreigners Act, which talks about the penalty for contravention of provisions of the Act. So penalty is prescribed under the Section 14 of the Foreigners Act. So we look into the three aspects, but we miserably fail to find refugee word as such under any other documents in any law, any statutory or constitution. So nowhere refugee has been defined. Nowhere refugee is no. It's more through the judicial innovation. It's more with the honorable judges, they try to give some kind of humanitarian relief. What humanitarian consideration for refugees, which they have done invoking the Part 3 of the Indian Constitution, which I'll come later on. So whatever the relief which foreigners have got in India, that is through the Part 3 of the Indian Constitution, and even recently, in 2017, a case was filed in the Supreme Court of India, Suleiman versus Union of India, that is still pending. And it's a serious case which involves the deportation of the Rohingya refugees. The case is still pending before the Supreme Court of India. We have series of cases which we'll look into the later on. So first we come to the law, which we look into the Foreigners Act and then constitutional provisions, particularly part 3. So Foreigners Act gives the definition of who is it. So even refugee has been brought under the Foreigners Act, and expulsion of foreign national, deportation of foreign nationals, restriction of the movement of the foreigners in India, that has been governed. Even if a foreigner who has overstayed in India, visa has expired, everything has covered under the Foreigners Act of 1946. So that is the main law. Then we come to the another important aspect, which I feel is the section 2D. So as a judge, honorable judges and a lawyer, when you look, so what are the instruments we can take help of? So we can use the Foreigners Act, we can use the Constitution, and we can use also the Protection of Human Rights Act. So these are the documents as a lawyer and as honorable judges can be useful for the protection of refugees. But our efforts is the first to define who are refugees, what are the protection is available to refugees, and rest of the things we'll discuss one by one. So when we look into the first, we try to search out the laws, and as honorable judges are aware, lawyers are aware, that Foreigners Act and then Indian Constitution. We can also supplement our argument or our everything using the Protection of Human Rights Act of 1993. So Protection of Human Rights Act is much wider. So Protection of Human Rights Act under the section 2D of the Protection of Human Rights, which defines what human rights means. So basically the protection of refugees is a humanitarian consideration. So when we take help of the Protection of Human Rights Act, this is the only instrument where human rights has been defined. Otherwise, in the cases, series of the cases, Supreme Court and High Courts have made an attempt using Article 21. Like honorable judges have defined the human rights. But a concrete definition for a law student, for a law teacher, if he says, what is the definition of human rights, then we find the definition has been given under Protection of Human Rights Act of 1993, that section 2D. So section 2D, what section 2D says? It says human rights means. So it's section 2D of the Protection of Human Rights Act says, section 2D, human rights means the rights relating to life, liberty, equality, and dignity of the individual guaranteed by the Constitution. So section 2D of the Protection of Human Rights Act defines human rights. Human rights means the rights relating to life, liberty, equality, and dignity of the individual guaranteed by the Constitution. So if I take that definition, first part of this, so there are, and then it goes further, guaranteed by the Constitution and or embodied in the international covenants. It also takes about the definition if it prevails in the international covenant. So first part of the section 2D says human rights means the rights relating to life, liberty, equality, and dignity of the individual guaranteed by the Constitution or embodied in the international covenants or embodied in the international covenants and enforceable by courts in India. And enforceable by courts in India. So it means if international covenants, government of India has accepted the legal obligation, those treaties can be also applied for the definition of human rights and for any purposes that the international treaties can be useful tool to build an argument in the court or before the honorable judges. So if I take the embodied in the international covenant or enforceable by courts in India, then I take you to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Universal Declaration of Human Rights as such is not a legally binding instrument, but over the years it has acquired the status of customary international law. So Universal Declaration of Human Rights has acquired the status of customary international law in and once a treaty acquires the status of customary international law, it automatically binding to all sovereign states, everyone. So a treaty, multilateral treaties or international treaties, if it acquires the status of customary international law, then treaty becomes binding to the state. It's not the subject to Conventional obligation, whether you are signed or ratified, these procedural aspects are not required. When a treaty acquires the part of the customary international law, it applies to all states. So if I stretch the definition of Section 2D of the Protection of Human Rights, which talks about the enforceable by courts. So it means Universal Declaration of Human Rights is enforceable in a such. It has to be argued strongly and say, it has acquired the status of customary international law, and court has to look at least for the persuasive value, at least consider what Universal Declaration of Human Rights speaks. So why I'm emphasizing, why I'm arguing for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the one instrument which talks about the protection of refugee much before international refugee law, much before evaluation of international refugee law. So what we see, the protection of refugee was guaranteed much before a normative framework was developed related with the refugee law. So 1948, when Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted on 10 December, there are two articles which are very important. There are two articles which are very important here under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we can also draw some kind of analogy by looking into these two articles, Article 13 and Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When we look into the Article 13, which is more or less what we have under the Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. So Universal Declaration of whatever it speaks, Article 19, that is there in the Article 13 of the Indian Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 13 says, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. So within the state we can move freely, which is guaranteed under the Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. So what Article 13 talks about, it also talks about freedom of movement and residence of individual or citizen of a country, any parts of from one part to the another part is there. So that is guaranteed. So Article 13 of the there. Then the second, so Article 13 has two paragraphs. 13.1 talks about the domestic perspective, when it gives power to us. So what power has been given? Article 13.1, that is there already under the Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. So Article 13.2 talks about, so I don't see any problem anybody to implement the Article 13.1 because it has more or less similar thing under the Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. But when we look into the Article 13.2, it gives everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own. So we have a right to leave the country also, for the economic purposes, so individual has a right to move from his country to another country in search of job, in search of education, in search of resettlement, in search of anything, people can lawfully move from one country to another country. That's so Government of India also permits, so people in search of job, in search of education. So lawfully movement of people is not a problem. Lawfully movement, so lawfully people are migrating, and today we have around in world 17% migrant populations from India in the world. We have highest number lawfully people have moved from one country to the another country in search of job, and we constitute around 17% of the total world populations, and we are the highest number of the people who migrated. So migration as such, I'm not little bit it's confused with the refugee, but migration as such is permissible as a under the international law, under the domestic law, also people can move in this such lawfully movement of population is there. So it says Article 13 paragraph 2, it says everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return his own country. It's once I've gone out, government should not for any valid reason say, you are not allowed to come. That will amount to violation of my rights. If there is a lawfully denial is possible, that can be justified, but any arbitrary way it cannot be stopped. So if lawfully there is a ground, then so individual has a right to go out and return to his country. So that looks very fine. There's no problem in that. Now we come to the next article, which is very important, and that is when we talk about the human rights of the refugee, we take help of Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When we talk about the protection of refugee through human rights instruments, so when we talk about the protection of refugee in India, we talk about the Part 3 of the Indian Constitution. Similarly, when we talk about the protection of refugees in international context, we take root of Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 14 is the first article which protects the refugees worldwide. Everywhere, refugees protected through the article. The court has a duty to see how Article 14 effectively respected, recognized, and implemented in the domestic context, irrespective of the state, whether it's India, Nepal, Bangladesh, or any country. So all countries are bound by the Article 14, implementation of Article 14, or that will help court in looking into that. Because Article 14 says everyone has a right to seek. Everyone has a right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So the term, which is the first time we said, asylum from persecution. So a person who has entered, so who are entering? So like, we have two categories. People can move freely, lawfully. But in cases where there is a fear of persecution, there is a possibility you have lost all the documents. Just to save your life, without documents, you have crossed the international border. And then you seek asylum in the host country. So everyone, a person who has a fear of persecution. So what it says, everyone has a right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So asylum from persecution. It doesn't say asylum from employment, asylum from persecution. So if a fear of persecution is there, person has entered. So if in India, if a person who has entered from Afghanistan, one person who has entered from the Sudan, or person who has entered from the Rohingyas also, for an example, if they have entered because they are persecuted. So there's a justification. Now how government of India handles, how court looks into this aspect. But Rohingyas populations in 2015 onwards entered in India and settled in number of other places. Some are recognized and some are unrecognized. That questions we'll take later on. So what we see, the persons, Rohingya people, they have fear of, they persecuted. Their houses were burned, women were raped, properties were taken away, and they were forced to leave country. So they were forced to leave country. So a state which has an obligation, when we talk about the state, so a state has an obligation to protect the rights. A state has a fundamental duty, and that is the reason in the constitution, lordships, when we start constitution, particularly part 3, state has given the Article 12. There was a discussion in the Constituent Assembly debate where they said why state has to be there in the part 3 of the Indian Constitution. So B.R. Ambedkar said no, state has a fundamental. State has a duty. Who will protect the rights? Not individual. Individually, you give the right to individual, but protection, some mechanism has to be there. So state has a responsibility to protect, state has a responsibility to promote, state has a responsibility to fulfill the rights. So state has a major obligation. So state role is very important. And then who is violating your rights? It's always state. So generally public officials, even in the cases of protection of human rights and even the laws which have developed by the Supreme Court of India, it's always violation by the public officials. Like those who are working on behalf of the sovereign, they are accused of the violation. It's a jail officials, police officers, and so and so forth. So public officers. So that is the important. So state, those who are working on behalf of the state. So that is the reason here. So refugee, once they enter, so it's an obligation of the receiving state. In one sense, I'm saying in general, every state has its own limitations, every state has its own issues, challenges, and a lot of issues are there. But when we read and discuss in a law, without looking into the other perspective of the state and other concern, then application of law becomes very simple. But when we start applying law with the societal or contextually, then we see there are a lot of issues or challenges. So national security comes in an issue. There are spying. There is economic issues comes. So there are a lot of issues linked with the refugees are there, and that complicates issue in the protection of refugees by the state and also by the court. Whether how long you want to keep the refugee population in your territory, how many years Rohingyas will stay here, whether they will go back after situation gets normal, whether they will return back to the Myanmar, or they will become additional population of India permanently. These are the questions which, like, honorable judges also look into, and court and state also looks. Okay, how much population we can admit and make it a permanent population, integrate in the society, because we have your own challenges. So those issues are there, which, like, little bit is there. But when you simple application of law, what law is, so application as it is, black and white, then we see there is an obligation of the state to respect a person who has a fear of persecution on that particular day. And then, so I'm just like, I'll leave it here in the Article 14. So what we have seen, Lordships and Honorable Sirs, that we have human rights instrument also there in that particular. Now we go to the most important, like, when, so some way we have some idea that there is a reasonable ground. There is a reasonable ground under the domestic perspective for the protection of refugee exist. There is a reasonable ground for the protection of refugees exist in India. And of course, the other factors which needs to be taken care. And that is the reason in some cases, but those aspects will take it later on. But unfortunately, there is no refugee law in India or even in any South Asian countries, any domestic law. So far, South Asian countries have failed to adopt. Now, when we look into the refugee, and in this context, I would like to highlight there are three particular groups today: refugees, internally displaced person, and stateless person. Situations are more or less same. Refugees have also fear of persecution. Internally displaced persons have also fear of persecution, and stateless person, there is no nationality. There is no citizen of any country. So stateless is also very serious issue. Today, as an interesting fact, we have in the world around 45 to 50 millions internally displaced persons. And we have around 26 millions around refugees. So refugee populations have come down and internally displaced persons population have increased over the years. The distinction between the internally displaced person and distinction between the refugees, which will take little bit later. Let me start with the refugees. Who are the refugees? So we fail to find any concrete definition under the Foreigners Act of 1946. So our domestic law is outrightly silent regarding the definition of refugees. So we have not defined who are refugees, but how we are using the definition of refugee. So definition of refugee, we all take root of the United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees of 1951. UN Convention on the Status of Refugees. So there is like a convention, UN Convention on the Status of Refugees 1951. And its protocol 1967. So international level, respected sirs, we have only two instruments at the international level. United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees 1951 and its protocol of 1967. Interestingly, when Refugee Convention was adopted in 1951, it is more Eurocentric. Everybody, those who were involved in the drafting of the United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees, they thought refugees generated largely because of the First World War and Second World War. And because of the war, they said, we focus on the war and there will be no refugees subsequently. So they said because of the First World War and Second World War, refugees there. And that is why it has two limitations. 1951 Convention initially had two limitations: temporal limitation and geographical limitation. Temporal limitation and geographical limitation. So this convention which came into effect in 1954, the convention which came into effect in 1954, adopted in 1951, it says it has mandate to deal refugees prior to the 1st January 1951. So prior to the 1st January 1951. So convention came into force in 1954, but it has a limitation. It says only refugees prior to the 1st January 1951. Even 1955, you address the refugees which were there in 1948, 49, 36 or something, but not after 1st January 1951, because there was a clear idea because of the world wars, these refugees are there. So it is a time limitation, 1st January 1951. And geographical limitation, what it says, it applies to only the European nations, only the European countries. So refugees from the European and other country can accept if they volunteer. So it was open. So there are two limitations, temporal limitation and geographical limitation was there under the 1951 convention. These two limitations were subsequently removed by the 1967 protocol. So 1967 protocol does only, it remove temporal limitation and geographical limitation under the 1951 convention. So after 1967, this convention is open for everyone, all nations, and for all the countries, all the time. So after protocol, so what protocol has done? Protocol has simply done away two limitation, temporal limitation and geographical limitation. And since then, this convention has become universal convention in a true sense and applies to all nations in that particular thing. So thus, it has relevance. So today, when we are discussing, so 1951 convention has a relevance. However, India is not party to the 1951 convention. India is not party of the 1951 convention, India 1967 protocol. So we are technically not bound by the 1951 convention and 1967 protocol. But we have used, courts also have used in many times 1951 convention. Let me just read out the definition and then we'll quickly go move fast, Lordship. What it says, Article 1A of the convention, Article 1A of the 1951 convention, Article 1A of the 1951 convention defines who are refugees. So we'll get a definition of refugees today. And that definition is tested and valid and accepted. It's a tested, valid and accepted by all nations. So when it comes to the definition, they use 1951 convention. Even in the trial court, district level court in Delhi, we have seen they look into when they try to decide a case related with the Myanmari women, they looked into the refugees definition on the 1951 convention. So courts also cited 1951 definition. What 1951 definition says, an individual, so convention is individual, it's not collective of people. So guarantees to individual, that is also when refugee takes place, it's like a large. So if Rohingya refugees, if they are protected under the 1951 convention, then it means each individual case has to be decided by the relevant body, each individual. So it starts with an individual who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted. So let me just sum up the definition, what it says. An individual who has well-founded fear of being persecuted on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership of a particular social group. Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership of particular social group. And who have crossed international border. The crossing international border is equally important. So who has crossed international border and outside of his country of residence. So crossing international. So three elements are there under the 1951 convention. First, persecution. Second, grounds. And third, crossing of international border. So from your home state, you cross international border. Those who fail to cross international border, they have a first condition, they have fear of persecution. They are also persecuted on the ground of race or religion or national or political opinion. But they fail to cross international border. They remain in the country, they move from the one part to the another part, like Kashmiris people. They have like government, then government was duty to protect, but government failed. So they failed to cross international border, but they moved from one part of the Kashmir to the mainland, they came down. So they are like that, but we use the term refugees, Kashmiri refugees. We generally use the term Kashmiri refugee, but if you apply the definition which we just, one element is missing. One element in the Kashmiri refugees, because they fail to cross international border. They remain in India. So according to the definition of given under the 1951 Convention, Article 1A, crossing of international border is equally important. So in those who fail to cross, they are not refugees. They are not qualified as a refugees according to the 1951 Convention. So what they remain, they are known as internally displaced persons. So that is the discussion. They are internally displaced persons. So Kashmiri people are displaced persons. They are displaced. They are internally displaced because of the conflict, because of the religious conflict, because of the war, because of the armed conflict. So people have been displaced. So displacement, when we look into the displacement, we see natural displacement, like then conflict, natural disaster induced displacement, conflict induced displacement, and the third is development induced displacement. So they are the displaced persons. They are also persecuted. So Kashmiri refugees, in according to the they are known as internally displaced person. I take you back what I said a few minutes earlier, that we have refugees, we have internally displaced persons. And today we have more number of internally displaced persons in the worldwide. We have more than 45 million people in the internally displaced person at present. So we have a large number of internally displaced persons in worldwide, in African continent and Asian continent. These internally displaced persons, largely because of ethnic conflict and also the religious conflict, and or also non-international armed conflict. Non-international armed conflict, ethnic conflict, and religious conflict has created a huge number of internally displaced persons at the world. But protection to the internally refugee law is not available to the internally displaced person. So application of refugee law is not possible because they have failed to cross internal. So they will be protected by the same state using the constitutional law or other laws, and also through the international human rights instrument. International human rights instrument, for them, except refugee law, all laws will be applicable. But if you become the refugees, then you have the refugee laws is there. In India, all right. So now this is the convention. So large number of states are, so this is the definition of refugees are there. A large number of states are not parties to the 1951 convention, including India. Once you admit a new population, so what you have to do? You have to take care of the right to life, the right to health, right to education, social security. So second stage for the host state or receiving state will be more about the economic, social and cultural rights, social security to the refugees, house to refugees, medical facilities to refugees, education to refugees, employment to the refugees. And till you have made an arrangement, you have to, state has to continuously feed them. Because you admit the people and without any taking care of their personal needs, that will also violation of the human rights. And that is the reason poor states, they feel when we are not in a position to take care of a large number of people, our own people, then how we will handle this? So there's so it's a political issues, and it's also other issues there where states are little bit silent on that particular time. So once refugees are admitted, all economic, social rights become active. So first, right to life, Once you admit, then all directive principles of state policy becomes relevant for the citizens as well as the non-citizen. You may not give it employment, but at least you have to give something to sustain them. That is state, every state has to do that. That is the economic regions is also a deterrent factor for large number of the states not choosing to become party of the 1951 convention. The most stumbling block or the most serious problem in the 1951 convention is not about the definition, it's not about the admission. It's about time period. How long a refugee has to be taken care by the host state. And there, what we witness, what we observe, refugee has an upper hand. Refugee has an upper hand. Once a refugee is admitted in a country, even the condition which force them to leave their country is no longer there in the state of origin. So a condition which has compelled a person to leave his country, after 5 years, things have become normal in his country. So according to improved situation, according to changed situation, refugee has to go back. But the decision of returning back to his motherland is the refugees. It's not the receiving state. If for any reasons he feel, no, I have moved from Bangladesh to Canada, I don't want to go now. Now Bangladesh has a democratic form of a government, everything is good, I know. But I feel for my betterment, my family betterment, I want to stay in Canada. I came to Canada as a refugee and now I have a job, now I have everything. I can go back, but I don't want to go back. So going back has to be voluntary. It has to be voluntary. Canadian government will not say, no, you go back. No, things are okay. You have to go back. And what is there? And they are protected by Article 33 of the 1951 Convention, which says principle of non-refoulement. Principle of non-refoulement. No one shall be expelled. Expulsion of refugees are prohibited. Principle of non-refoulement, and then they say principle of non-refoulement has acquired the status of customary international law. Again, that Article 33, so refugee you admit, you can't send them back. You have to keep them permanently in your territory. It's only on the refugees. If you remember in Tamil Nadu, state of Tamil Nadu, when large number of Sri Lankan refugees, they are still there in Tamilian origin. And 1992, there was an accusation that government of India is forcibly transferring population, forcibly sending people to the Tamil, Sri Lanka. And that is the time government of India has asked UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, to establish an office in Chennai only to look for the repatriation. And they say, we have not used any force. All repatriation was voluntary and we have not violated convention, but to ensure that integrity, we want UNHCR to regulate the repatriation. So repatriation which is taking place in Tamil Nadu is under the supervision of the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So in India, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees have two offices, one in Delhi and another in Chennai. So Chennai office only looks into the repatriation, voluntary repatriation, okay, whether this person actually they want to go back to Sri Lanka or government is forcing them to go. That to ensure that 1992 onwards, Chennai office is there. So that is another serious issue, repatriation issue, because once you admit, you have no control, you have no say. How long they will be there, it's up to the refugees to decide. All right. So that is the reason a large number of countries are not keen to become party of the 1951 convention. In India, we have allowed, we are not party of the 1951 convention and 1967 protocol. However, in 1969, we have allowed refugees, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, United Nations, High Commissioner for Refugees office to function. So UNHCR has a mandate worldwide. UNHCR has a mandate to implement 1951 Convention. So who will monitor implementation? It's a United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We are not party of the UNS 1951 Convention, but still we have asked UNHCR to function in Delhi from 1969. It started with the Tibetan refugees and now also in the 1992 in Chennai. So what UNHCR does in India? UNHCR has been given a certain mandate to determine, and that is called Refugee Status Determination Test, RSDT, Refugee Status Determination. Court has to look into that part. So Government of India has authorized, not being party to the 1951 Convention, Government of India has authorized UNHCR office to function from Delhi in 1969 and also 1992 in Chennai to look into the repatriation in Chennai, but Delhi office has been given a mandate to decide whether he's a genuine refugee or he is a fake refugee. Whether he's a genuine refugee, so who will decide? So a refugee comes to your part at an office, like a refugee appears before the Honorable Justice Ramakrishnan and then says, I'm a refugee, kindly grant. So lots of people will look into the documents, whether he has fear of persecution. And if UNHCR gives us a tag or identity, we have tested, we have found. So refugees, so UNHCR, what UNHCR is doing in India, there are a lot of things they are doing, but one important, they are identifying genuine refugees or fake refugees. So each refugee has to appear before the UNHCR. Not all, but certain countries like Afghanistan, Myanmar, then Sudan, Sri Lanka, not Sri Lanka, Sudan, Iraq, Iran. So like a number of African countries or Asian countries, mandate has been given to the UNHCR to decide. Not from the Sri Lankan refugees, not from Bangladesh. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Ministry of Home Affairs takes care. So UNHCR has no role in people coming from the Bangladesh and other countries or even from the Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is monitored by the Ministry of Home Affairs and Chennai Tamil Nadu government, they both coordinate. So, but small refugees number from the Asian and African countries, Somalia, Sudan, Iraq, Iran, Ethiopia, all mandate has been given to the UNHCR. And UNHCR first receives application. So once you enter in the country, so you are asylum seeker. So once you are an asylum seeker, but not all asylum seekers will become refugees. But all refugees are asylum seekers. But not all asylum seekers will become refugees. So asylum seekers have to pass a test. They qualify according to the 1951 Convention. So a person who has a fear of persecution at first stage, when he enters in a territory, he is an asylum seeker. He is not a refugee. He is an asylum seeker. He wants a safety, security. And then he applies whatever system in place in that respective country to determine about his application for the refugee status. So he's asylum seeker initially, and then he applies. So he has given a permit to stay, and then say, okay, you go to the UNHCR, you put your application, or you put your application to Ministry of Home Affairs, or any, it depends upon the country to country. And then they will decide whether you are genuine refugees or you have just entered in for any other reasons, economic reasons, fake refugees. So there are a lot of people who are for economic reasons. So they will look into that. So UNHCR in India, they do the Refugee Status Determination Test, RSDT, Refugee Status Determination Test. UNHCR office also provides some financial assistance to the refugees. UNHCR also represent them. There are a lot of refugees who are arrested under the Foreigners Act. Those who are detained in the Foreigners Act, they are represented by the UNHCR lawyers. They have private lawyers, they have hired. So many people, they have been detained under the Foreigners Act because they without visa, they overstay. So because there is no definition. So so UNHCR play very important role, hire a lawyer and then represent those cases before in Indian scenario. All right. So if we look into this particular thing, convention, because of permanent nature, the refugee solution is a permanent. If he comes in your country, then you have to look into, they can become a permanent liability, and that is there. Interestingly, in case of Rohingya, the case which is pending before the Supreme Court, there are 19,000 refugees out of 44. 19,000 are recognized by the UNHCR office in Delhi. 19,000 has valid documents. They have gone through that process, each individual. So 19,000 has a document that they are refugees, and who has validated that UNHCR has validated. So 50% of refugees. Now all of a sudden, government that become an international concern. They are fear of there is a threat to the national security. There is a threat to national security. So we have to deport all Rohingya refugees have to be deported, or large number of Rohingya refugees have to be deported, and that is the reason Suleiman versus Union of India case is pending before the Supreme Court. Whether country has a power to deport anybody, and there, of course, like deportation, if I look into the section 3, the power has been given to the central government to deport. But of course, deportation has to be followed due process of law. That court comes into many deportation order has been stayed, many deportation order has been challenged, and court looked into the whether procedural safeguard guarantees were taken care of not. That has been there. So role of the court comes into there. It's not like executive has an upper hand. The deportation order is passed and person has been. So always that can be challenged, and court looks into the various aspect, constitutional provisions and other things, and deportation order has been stayed. When we come to the Indian scenario, I start with the number of cases, but let me start with the Louis Deret versus Union of India. That case was decided in 1991. LOUIS, Louis Deret, RAEDT, Louis Deret versus Union of India. This case was 1991, 3 SCC 544. 1991, 3 SCC. And there the court had said, it's not refugee, but the court had said, the Supreme Court held that foreigners are, in 1991, entitled to protection of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. So court said, foreigners are also. Now Foreigners Act that gives power, but Article 21 is available to the foreigners also. So Article 20 of the Constitution, held that foreigners are entitled to protection of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. Thus, the state is bound to protect. Thus, the state is bound to protect the life and liberty of every human being. Thus, the state is bound to protect the life and liberty of every human being, whether he or she be a citizen or otherwise. The Constitution of India guarantees certain fundamental rights which are applicable to non-citizens, namely the right to equality, Article 14, the rights to personal liberty, 21, 25, and all cases is there. Then another case which has come, that is State of Arunachal Pradesh versus Khudiram Chakma. State of Arunachal Pradesh versus Khudiram Chakma case. That was decided is like AIR 1994, AIR 1994, SC 1461. AIR 1994, SC 1461. In this case, the court held that though foreigners are entitled to fundamental rights under Article 21, their right to life and liberty, does not include the right to reside and settle in the country as provided under Article 19, 1D and E of the Constitution. They said your life is protected, but the same way Article 19 foreigners cannot enjoy. So that distinction, because Article 19 is only available to the citizen, not the foreigners there. And interestingly, lordships and respected sirs, as I said, in this case, the court also referred to Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then the another case which is related with it's a High Court judgment. That is very interesting part, lordship, and sirs, that is PK Kaul versus State Officer. PK Kaul versus State Officer, decided by Delhi High Court case. That is the 2010 PK call versus state officer. 2010 SCC online Delhi 4207. As we discussed, there is no law of the internally displaced persons. That is very important. How Indian judiciary, high courts and Supreme Court also take note of the international instrument. Though there is no legal binding instruments to deal with the internally displaced person, however, there is a soft law. Soft law, there's a guiding principles on internally displaced person. So international community has adopted a soft law that is not binding, guiding principles on internally displaced person in 1998. So what is the document we have? That is the guiding principles of internally displaced persons of 1998, not legally binding. But court has taken, Delhi High Court. So that is what I'm saying. The High Court of Delhi dealt with the issue of IDPs from Kashmir. So court has interpreted correctly. Court says, no, they are not Kashmiri refugees. PK call is the, he was like, displaced from the Kashmir and had took a job in Delhi. He worked for till his retirement, and he was staying in the government accommodation. So once after retirement, state Ministry of Urban concerned ministry asked them to vacate the flat because you are no longer, you are retired. Then he said, no, I'm a government officer, I'm retired, but I'm a displaced person. Now state has an obligation. Where I'll go? I have no place. So I have come, I have been displaced. So court look into it. So the matter has gone to the court. PK call has challenged in the court the order of the state officer, and then court says the High Court of Delhi dealt with the issue of IDPs from Kashmir. The court questioned the eviction order. The court questioned the eviction order issued by the government ordering IDPs to vacate the government accommodation where they lived as a government servants. The court extensively referred to international human rights instruments, and also various provisions of the guiding principles of internally displaced persons 1998 were cited. So you see, the Delhi High Court, I think Justice Geeta Mittal was there in this particular case. She has extensively took help of the international instruments and 1998 guiding principles. The another important case, which is National Human Rights Commission versus State of Arunachal Pradesh. That is also a landmark case, National Human Rights Commission versus State of Arunachal Pradesh, AIR 1996, SC 1235. AIR 1996, SC 1235. And this is related with the citizenship issue. It's a lot, they are Chakmas are stateless. Due to the local politics, their citizenship application was never considered, and there are a lot of issues were there. So Chakmas, those who are living for second, third generation, fourth generation Chakma, not the first generation Chakma, but they were living there, but they are not citizenship, neither they're Indian citizen nor Bangladesh. So they became actually stateless person in Arunachal Pradesh. So National Human Rights Commission took, you say the state institution, National Human Rights Commission took this matter and filed a case, agreed jurisdiction under the state of Arunachal Pradesh. And the court dealt with the issue of this petition was filed by the and this writ petition came before the Supreme Court mainly for the enforcement of fundamental rights of about 65,000 Chakmas under Article 21 of the Constitution. It involved the issue of Chakmas settled in Arunachal Pradesh being persecuted by certain sections of the citizens of Arunachal Pradesh, and their application for the citizenship was not guaranteed. That is there. There are two main issues conferring. There are two issues conferring of citizenship. The first, conferring of citizenship, and second, fear of persecution by certain sections of the citizens of the Arunachal Pradesh. So they have Chakmas have a fear of persecution, and second was conferring the citizenship issue was there. Just to quickly, the court directed. So court directed, issued directed for the taking serious note of their request and granting the citizenship. This matter again came in the committee for CR of C.R of C.A.P. and others versus the state of Arunachal Pradesh. This I have looked into the Indian Kanun case. This is also related with the same case, non-compliance of the earlier judgment. So the court directed the Ministry of Home Affairs to grant citizenship to Chakma and Hazong tribal who migrated to India in 1964-69 and were settled in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. There are 2-3 cases quickly we'll say and then we'll finish lots. In the another important case, Chandrima Das versus the Chairman Board and others. I think I missed, I have not given the citation. But Chandrima Das, very famous case, and maybe our friend will give you. Chandrima Das versus the Chairman Board, Railway Board, and others. In this case, court granted compensation. In this case, the court granted compensation to a Bangladesh woman who was gang raped in the Rail Jatri Niwas in Habra station. So a foreign national was granted compensation because she was sexually assaulted and rape was committed by the Rail Jatri Niwas in Habra railway station. In this case, the court in depth discussed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and mentioned number of articles. And court said that Universal Declaration of Human Rights transcends all borders and are to be respected in every country, irrespective of the nationality, sex, race, and religion, and everything. So you see lots of, like, even Chandrima Das court has recognized Universal Declaration, which I started, and then court has said, it has to be recognized and it has to be respected there. And then court says, though victim is a Bangladeshi national, she is entitled to compensation. Further, fundamental rights, especially under Article 21, states right to life, and that has been interpreted in several cases to mean a dignified and secured life, which has been clearly abrogated. So Article 21 and compensation, that has been. Then another case, just 2 important case, I'll leave that you can look into, but that case is more on the which court said that's ultra virus illegal migrant determination tribunal, illegal migrants determination by tribunals act 1983. That is a very important case. Sarvanand Sonowal versus the current chief minister of Assam. Sarvanand Sonowal versus Union of India. Sarvanand Sonowal versus Union of India. 2005 SCC 665. In this case, the court has declared that the illegal migrant determination by tribunals act and then illegal migrants determination by tribunals rules in 1984 were declared ultra virus of the Constitution of India and were ordered to struck down. So I leave there. Then we come to the 2 important and last case. There are many cases, but that had changed. That first is the 2 cases where the status of Tibetans in India changed. The status of the Tibetan had changed a little bit. The first case, Namgyal Dolgar, Namgyal. Namgyal Dolgar versus Government of India. Namgyal Dolgar versus Namgyal Dolgar versus Government of India, Ministry of Exterior. In this case, the High Court of Delhi, this is a High Court judgment, Delhi High Court. The High Court of Delhi interpreted the Citizenship Act and stated that the Act applies to all children born in India. That Act, Citizenship Act, applies to all children born in India, irrespective of parents' nationality. So means any birth. So it means Citizenship Act was applicable. If birth taken place in India, that specific time means whether parents are from the Africa or like any other country, natural citizenship, the birth takes place. So it says like that. The High Court of Delhi interpreted the Citizenship Act and stated that Act applies to all children born in India, irrespective of parents' nationality. And then it says between January 26, 1950 and July 1st, 1987. So Citizenship Act was, natural citizenship was granted from the January 26, 1950 to 1st July 1987. After 1987, Citizenship Act was amended many times. Citizenship Act now ninth time has been amended. So Citizenship Amendment has amended, and natural citizenship just simply by birth, that has been changed. Parents' status become important. Lot of changes has taken place 1987. But prior amended Citizenship Act from 26 January 1950 to 1st July 1987. So any birth which has taken place in India, all were entitled to become Indian citizens. In case of Tibetans, they opted for retain. They said they did not opt for the Indian citizen. The problem was something else. Tibetans, they opted for continue with the Tibet, and they did not opt for the Indian citizenship. So Tibetans were given an identity number. Each Tibetan in India has an identity number. And the dispute, that girl, she went to the court. She said, I'm born in India and I consider myself an Indian. So passport officers or public relation officers of the passport center, he said, you have not filled the right column, because for Tibetans you have to give your number. You have that number, we'll give you the passport. She said, I'm Indian because I'm born on 13th July 1987, 13th April 1987. So she said, this the Citizenship Act is applicable to me. And court has also accepted. Court did not look into the other aspects, how Tibetans are governed, what are the special arrangements for the Tibetans. Court simply interpreted the Citizenship Act as it is, and then said, okay, any birth in this period, automatically they are Indian. And then this led to the second, where Tibetans have also participated in the voting in the Karnataka High Court judgment, that is Tenzin Chopeng linked Rinpoche, Tenzin, Tenzin, Tenzin Chopeng, Choephag, linked Rinpoche versus Union of India. And then it's given they have a right to vote, and then the election commission was directed. So first time in the election they participated also is there. So what I see, I'll conclude here, Lordships, though we are not party of the 1951 convention, though we are but court has always looked, whether it's a high court or Supreme Court, and even in the lower court sometimes, though they are not supposed, but they have whatever relief they could have provided, they have done. In number of cases, more humanitarian considerations. Humanitarian consideration, that is the prime consideration for deciding a person who is in a vulnerable situation. So court's approach, which they apply generally in all circumstances, when even the foreign nationals, they say they are vulnerable, they are persecuted. So how to look into, and then they search with the part 3 of the Constitution, international human rights instrument, and try to provide the relief to the victim. And just see the PK Kaul case. There is no need of internally. So he served in the government, he got an accommodation, he stayed in the government, and then a lawful order was passed. But he made an argument, I don't want to leave. Where I'll go? He could have bought a property also, but he said, I don't want to leave government accommodation. And court agreed with his argument, he's an internally displaced person. So state has a responsibility to provide accommodation, otherwise alternative accommodation to him. If you want him to leave the government accommodation, so all the displaced persons, you have to take care. So what I see, and then in both, to conclude, both national or international perspective, though there is no law, but India has a great track record, not in the after independence, even before the independence, we always encourage, it's a melting pot. People came from all the, and Kerala is the great example. People have come from all parts of the world, settled there and integrated in this society. They became, so Vasudev Kutumbakam. So we say, it's a home for the, so everybody can come. And gradually when populations and things have started changing in the beginning of the, end of the 20th centuries and beginning of the 21st centuries, little bit some kind of shift in the approach has been both by the courts and by the by the government also is taking place in the refugees. But more or less, India is considered worldwide for the protection. India is considered, and Indian judiciary is respected for the protection of refugees worldwide. With this, I thank all honorable judges and all respected members for giving me an opportunity and sharing my thought on a very important topic, which I consider. So over to Premrajji. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, Manoj Kumar Sinha, sir. I mean, during times when fingers are being pointed at the country for being not up to standard on very many fronts, at least as far as imbibing or assimilating anybody who comes to India, we got a good track record. That itself is a, I mean, good indication. Over to you, Ram Kumar, sir, for your comments.
Thank you, Shyam. Very insightful articulation by Professor Manoj Kumar Sinha on refugee laws. We in Kerala, we don't have this refugee problem, except this problem of migrant workers. But as the law secretary to the government, I had seen political refugees whenever a new ministry is sworn in. Aspirants, including some members of the legal profession also, flocking in the secretariat, government secretariat, for assignments under the newly formed ministry. That is only a refugee law I have come across. Now, when India, the refugees, persons who seek asylum, political or otherwise, persons who are captives, persons who are, what should I say, fugitives, are they treated alike in our country? And when India is not a signatory to the 51 Convention and the 1967 Protocol, legally are we bound to honor the directions therein, though on humanitarian grounds? I don't know. And if genuine,
we are once they enter, like problem is somewhere. So sometimes we don't know. Many times people like border security force or BSF, they send people, they don't admit. So like once they cross, they enter in the territory. It's not you and me. There are a lot of like sectors, public that NGOs working in that field, like academicians working in that field. So once anybody, whether lawfully and particularly a person has entered from the like a Myanmar, when country of origin fact is known.
Is not this border infiltration due to the failure of the border security force?
No, but under international law, you have to, so there's an broad obligation. If a person's life is in a danger, and you know that what is happening in the, like we have seen 1971. 1971, 10 million Bangladeshi crossed India. We gave them shelter. Out of 10 million, 6 million returned back after the independence. But immediately Indira Gandhi did not look into the 1951 Convention, 1967 Protocol. They said that all Bangladeshis are welcome. And it continued in people from Bangladesh. So that is, so because conflict was going on, West Pakistan was brutality were committing. It was known to everyone. So India took an opportunity also, whatever you say, political, diplomatic score, but ultimately relief was provided. People, where do people to go? Same thing in the Sri Lanka, same in Myanmar. So such a difficult situation, though state guards their border they try to see that people should not enter. Once they enter, it's very difficult to send them back. So what we states are doing, European states and other states, they are guarding their border strictly. Nobody can enter in their territory unless they have lawful documents. So since our porous border is there, you stop here, somebody else some side, so they can enter. And what you will do? They don't want to go back. Then you have to take them to detention center. Yes. You detain them, their prosecution 5 years in the jail, section 14 of the Foreigners Act will come. They said, we don't want to come, take me to the prison. Then a UNHCR will come, represent them. They say, no, it's a violation of international law. You have to keep them. So there are a lot of so guarding the border strictly, that is the only
Yes,
concrete measures.
exactly. But for the faults of the guardians, the country suffers, and we are too soft
Yes,
that and repatriation is for genuine refugees, is it not? And fake refugees, it is deportation, is it not?
fake refugees, like, Bangladesh is not refugees. They are economic migrants. They come here, they look like same, they speak Bangla in East, Calcutta and other cities. They get all the documents and they become the citizen. But actually they are Bangladeshi. And their number. So the first time Citizenship Act Act was amended in 1986 or 87. The reason was that in country, like the entire country, the certain regions, particularly eastern part of India, there is a 26% increase in the population compared to the other parts. So they said we have to do something. And that is the reason Citizenship Amendment had made. And then, like in the status of parents, lawfully entering, a lot of changes have been done in the Citizenship Amendment Act. So because of the porous border, and particularly issue is much serious when we look into but they come for the economic reasons. There is no persecution as such. After they are all for this in search of job. Even in Kerala, even in other parts, now they are coming to the remote, like, far away. Easily they can stay or they can save.
Very insightful articulation. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you, sir.
Ramkumar, sir. Over to you, Justice Ramakrishnan, sir.
Is without a law, persons who are infiltrating into India being protected. That is what we understood from your because even our own people are not getting that much protection. In fact, one. Secondly, we are not able to understand whether they are genuine persons or not genuine persons, whether they are having they come with some oblique motive or not.
Fugitives, many of them are fugitives.
Fugitives. And if they come with some other object and infiltrate and do something and go back, or they are not going back, claiming to be refugees here, then also if you apply the principles of liberty, right to life, etc., then it is very difficult to send them back also, unless you define them as enemies or alien people. That may be very difficult also. That may be the reason why recently the amendment came to Citizenship Act, whereby you will have to have a register for these things to maintain who is our citizen, so as to give them some protection, which in law they are entitled for, it appears.
Yes, sir.
But unfortunately, according to me, my personal thing, it has been unfortunately being wrongly interpreted, saying that it is targeting a particular type of people. It appears that was the reason why it was not able to be implemented in its letter and spirit sometimes. I do not know why.
That's true, sir.
Okay, it's a very good, very informative lecture we have given on a subject which has not been touched by us at all. Normally, because we don't have any opportunity to deal with these aspects. Even in High Court of Kerala is concerned, very little, unless Passport Act, some cases may come. And their visa overstay, you have no other option but to deport them. They cannot say that I want to stay back here. So they have no other option but to deport. For that purpose, deportation procedures have been taken. Then you will have to go there and they will be sending back to their own religion. So as far as Bangladeshis are also concerned, I think, during war period and the independence, maybe there may be some cases where they came here for a protection of life, where their life is under threat there. But thereafter, as far as West Bengal is concerned, most of the people were getting citizenship also. They are getting vote. I do not know what are all the documents they are having with them for the purpose of getting those things, etc. As far as the Sri Lankan refugees in Tamil Nadu also, I think that
they are not audible.
Sri Lankan refugees, as far as Tamil Nadu is also concerned, they don't have any document. They don't have any citizenship also, but they are staying here on the basis of the protection that has been given or understanding between the Sri Lankan and Indian government. That's all. That's the only thing that appears. Only on humanitarian consideration, as you have said, India is a country where everybody is welcome, and we won't send them out even if they are not able to go. If they want, or if they do not want, they want to stay here, they can safely stay here. Which protection you won't get anywhere. I don't think any other country will get such a protection. Thank you very much for the insightful articulation that has been made on a subject which don't have a regulated law, in fact. Thank you very much,
Thank
Manoj
you,
Kumar,
Mr.
sir.
Ramakrishnan, sir. Advocate Najib TP is to take a question. Najib, please.
Excellent articulation, sir, and I could get a very bird's eye view on the topic. And my question is, sir, is it mainly because of security reasons that India is not signing that convention or protocol? Is it mostly based on that?
It's like, you know,
So you're not audible. Manoj,
no,
sir.
government, even like, you know, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in the 19, she was there in the, participated in the, like later on the third committee, 1949, 1951, she said in one of the committee that it's more European centric convention. So opposition for the 1951 convention was there from the government representative from very beginning, always. And one of the reasons in the modern time, because UNHCR in Delhi and many academicians, they lobbied strongly that India should become party of the 1951 Convention, 1967 Protocol. When you are protecting refugees, when you are providing everything, then why not you become party of the 1951 Convention and 1967 Protocol? This will give you more weightage, like you get more financial assistance from the international organization and others. But I believe like once you become a party, it has some consequences in the sense you have no control, like sending them back. Like, you know, as I said, that Article 33, which talks about the principle of non-refoulement, you can't, like, you know, now you are 44,000 people are there. So though, like, you know, I have read the affidavit of the joint secretary, which is also available online on the Suleiman case. There he said, you know, principle of non-reform, India is not party, so we government has built up an argument in that case. We are not party of the 1951 convention, we are not party of the 1967 protocol, and we don't consider that principle of non-refoulement has acquired the status of customary international law. We have, like, you know, our own way of regulation, we are protecting the refugees, but there is other regions, so we want people to go back. So that matter is in the Supreme Court. So it's more political, and then
Political.
and government officers also, sometimes they have their own view. When they work as a government officer or you become the government lawyer, then you, like, you know, you have to defend a lot of things, what government psychology or government way of thinking. That is the challenges. Your own autonomy or your independent thinking, the way I'm speaking, that may not be there if they become part of the NHRC or become part of the anybody. So my language will change, and it will become more diplomatically. I believe that
financial assistance as of now. Are we taking any financial assistance? India is taking any financial assistance as of now?
and the financial assistance, like, you know, that UNHCR, as I said, UNHCR is functioning here. So UNHCR giving some directly to the refugees, not the government of India. So UNHCR, so once, like Mr. Lordship has said, that once refugees are coming, so UNHCR also find out whether it's a genuine refugees or fake refugees. So each application has to, in case of Rohingya, I said 19,000 refugees have been identified. Okay, they are genuine refugees by the UNHCR office, and they have given an identity document. Subsequently, the other Rohingyas, they did not go to the UNHCR because of the situation changed. They said if they will go there, they will be arrested or they will be detained. So initially they were going, and then large number of people have done. And that is the problem. So those who are recognized, with some support is provided by the UNHCR, not by the government of India.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry.
We'll go over to Rauser, KVJ Rauser, please.
So good evening. Thank you. Very, very insightful discussion. I am from the aviation field, and I look at the other side of the coin. That is when the refugees are deported, we need to handle them. So that becomes a very big issue, because sometimes there's a big ruckus at the airport itself. That's one thing. But India has always been open to others, and this is from the time from the Iranians, the Parsis that came into Gujarat, and then the Poland Jews that came into Gujarat, and things like that. The Rohingya Muslim that we are discussing barely is raising concern, which, like I said, I normally don't discuss political or religious issues, but being refugees, we have found most of them now occupying Kashmir. So people are wondering, how did they reach from the Burmese border to Kashmir? They couldn't move that fast in such a short span of time. So the government at times has to think also. See, if you're a refugee, you remain where you are. We will relocate you, or we will assign you, so we can keep a track of you. You see, we're not stopping you from coming. Yes, there is political persecution. Everything happens. Even we had it. 1984 is an example. 1984, we saw reverse political asylum. People from Punjab went into Europe and to Canada and to the US, and they tried it. So it is that it's a cycle that happens maybe once in a while in most countries. But the fact remains is that, can we, with given our economic situation, given our problems, start getting more people here and try to feed them and help them relocate? I mean, these people, once, even though their country is settled, they don't want to go back. Like, you take Burma, for example. Like, in between, there was a democratically elected government. Yes, now the military has taken over. That's another issue. But the fact remains is, even when they're stabilized, take Bangladesh. When it stabilizes, they went back. They should have gone back. I mean, they came with the Mukti Bahini, and that's what history taught us. 1971, we had to build a railway track only to move the refugees. Otherwise, Pakistan was going to kill them. From East Bengal, we built a railway track. So the fact remains is that we are expending much more than what we can really afford to maintain these refugees, and that is what is creating a problem. And like, as you also said, the economic refugees are a bigger problem for us. You see, like, they dislocate the local people, they're cheaper labor, and they're living on the streets. They add to the situation. The I mean, with regarding to slums, because I'm from Bombay and we found quite of the Bangladeshis here, and they add to the slums. You see, the system is not able to cope up with the amount of people coming in. So we need to look at it from that point of view also. I know the government takes a hard stand at times, and when with changing government situations, our political thinking, the lawyers will have to change, or the representatives will have to change their mind. But there has to be a line drawn somewhere, that this is what we will accept and this is what we cannot accept. Like today, like the Tibetans are contributing a lot to the country, but at the same time, once Tibet is formed, they will want to go back. I don't think the Tibetans would like to continue living in India today, because they're persecuted in China. They want to be settled here. Otherwise, there would be no problem. Anyway, sir, very good articulation, very good explanation. I learned a lot about a lot of the refugee, how
Thank
to
you, sir.
handle it. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rao sir. We have a research student from University of Malta. Over to you, Shahira.
Thank you for the lecture, sir. My question is with regard to access to education. Basically, I interviewed a few Rohingyan refugees who said that their students, as in their children, are not given any kind of certification for even passing grade 4 or grade 7. They are receiving the primary education, but they have nothing to show for it. Do we have any policies with regard to that for refugees?
For refugees children, you mean, Saira?
Yeah.
Like, there's some problem is there, like, no doubt, and even sometimes parents are not interested to send them to the school because of they are not sure whether they have been recognized, they have got all the documents. Sometimes lack of documents also become a concern, so they don't want to come into the public eye. But UNHCR, like, in Delhi and there we see the role of non-governmental organizations. Non-governmental organization working in the refugees area, they try to coordinate between the government, like certification and other aspects, and also at least for the primary education, they play very important role. In Delhi, I have seen a lot of
they do receive the education. They receive the education, but they don't receive any certification to prove that they've actually gone to school. So, like, when they are finished with grade 7 or grade 10, they're like essentially just getting up in the morning and going to school, but ultimately they don't have anything to show for it. So that basically stops them from having any further education, because obviously schools and colleges want documentation. And I was told that like they have approached UNHCR, but then of course, the process is delayed. You know, they're working on it, but then, yeah, I just wanted to ask. I guess we don't have any policies with regard to it.
No, we don't have, but if I believe Sri Lankan refugees, it's help of the local government also become very important. I think their system works more effectively.
Yeah, Sri
Even
Lanka
in Delhi,
earlier used to get college admissions and things.
yeah, and Afghanistani refugees in Delhi, their children are going to the school. They have passed in the school, colleges also. But if I take the same example of the Rohingyas refugees, if I take refugees from Somalia or some other places, there are so it's a country specific, uh, some positive steps are there in the education where state also supports, local government also supports, and it works very well. But where government itself is little bit serious and not happy, then they create a lot of problems. So no government school, if Rohingya children wants to go, they will say no, will not take it.
No, like of course the government has made a school for Rohingya students in Telangana, but then what they said was that yes, the kids do go to school, but then there is no certification. With regard to Afghani refugees, a lot of Afghani refugees who are in Delhi right now, they were changed to citizens. A lot of them got citizenship. So my question is, while they are in the refugee status, do they receive certification, or is there any provision for them to receive certification for this? I mean,
The
it's an oddly
certification
specific topic.
you mean in Afghanistani refugees?
Yes, who are in the refugee status.
No, but now it took long time basically for the Afghanistani refugees. So actually UNHCR officially, if I remember, around 17 to 18,000 Afghanistani refugees were there, recognized by they started with the Najibullah's time, and there are 18,000 refugees recognized, and I have seen also closely to them, and recently, maybe a couple of years back, they're they stayed more than 11 years to become Indian citizen. So after a long time they got the citizenship. So I believe they are working also. I'm not in very deeply on that aspect, but I believe there's not much problem in the certification and other things in the Afghanistani refugees
Right.
when it comes to that.
Okay. I guess it differs according to which place they are.
Like different. So it's a preferential treatment to spaces to some group and some group in a different.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Sahira. Thank you. Now over to you, Prem.
Well, Manoj, so that was an absolutely erudite talk. As I would feel that the CAA, that is perhaps the modern world's first refugee legislation, which subsumes by the hate and discrimination. And as you said, we have an internationally accepted definition of a refugee, which we see in the Convention of 1957 as well as the 67 Protocol. And we have no domestic regulation that would mention the word refugee. And ours is a nation which would rely on a thicket of other laws to take care of this particular issue. And the flow of foreign nationals to India, it is meant to be regulated either by the Foreigners Act of 1946, then we have the Foreigners Order of 1948, then you have the Passport Entry of India Act of 1920, you have the Passports Act of 67, and of course the Registration of Foreigners Act also. But at the same time, you can see that the Indian judiciary, we have taken a distinct stand that undocumented migrants who claim the status of a refugee, they were also given important procedural and substantive rights which cannot be denied. And you had mentioned a few cases. And to add a few more, you have in 1989 by the Guwahati High Court, and as well as by the Supreme Court in 1992, which countenances the protection from the deportation as an interim protection. Then the Sri Lankan deportation cases were injuncted by the Andhra Pradesh High Court in 1993. To add a few more. And the CAA, as you see, even though you can term it as a refugee law, it is being criticized as being remarkably selective, which is restricted to only Hindus, Buddhists, Parthis, Sikhs, Jains, and Christians from, say, like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. Now, India's silent omissions, which tailors to exclude certain communities, it is criticized as being resembling Donald Trump's executive order during 2016, when he banned the entry of Muslim people from the war-torn Syria, Iran, Iraq, etc. And of course, there was a legal pushback to this particular ban because US at that point of time, they had a well-defined refugee policy. But ours, unlike our country, we are not even a party to the 51 convention. I would think that the fate of these refugees that cannot depend on the goodwill of the politicians or any cynical political agendas, because we don't have even though we don't have a legal framework in India, you can see the constitutional framework. If you closely read the constitution, because see, this particular term refugee, even though it is not defined anywhere, you can see refugees in India, we consider them as aliens, as you rightly said. And this word alien that appears in the Indian constitution, you can see entry 17 of list 1, schedule 7. Then in CPC, you have a provision where the aliens can sue, like section 83. You have section 83. Similarly, you have that section 3 of the Citizenship Amendment Act. Kindly see, if you go and have a close read of the constitution, now that guarantees fundamental rights even to refugees, because the Supreme Court also, and the various courts of law, you can see the right to equality, Article 14. You have Article 21. You have Article 22. Then even Article 20, 25,
20.
even 32. These are all available to non-citizens, which includes refugees. Right. So the constitutional rights that protect the human rights of the refugee to live with dignity and much more. Because Article 21, as we see, it has been given a very, very liberal interpretation. Anyway, sir, that was absolutely insightful, as everybody had commented. And we desperately need a legislation which clearly lays down a refugee policy which does not differentiate between the communities. And of course, which should aim at protecting the people who flee from war or persecution and famine, rather than warding them off as outsiders or infiltrators, whatever that be. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. That was a really wonderful day for us, because in the 179 sessions we never touched upon this point or this topic. It was an eye-opener for us, in the sense like many of us, I mean, I'm just getting messages which say that we all were under the impression that we had a legal regime which covers and governs this field. Now, like the terminology used, the goodwill, the vagaries and things of the politicians and the ruling class decides and dictates it. And that too, we are dealing with human lives, whether they are Indians or otherwise. I mean, like you said, the reverse thing also, I mean, K.V.J. Rao sir had also said that the reverse thing had also happened. So it can happen to us as well. If Sri Lankans can come over, we at this end might at times, I don't know, if at all such an unlikely event comes, we may have to take refuge at Sri Lanka or something like that. Let there be an
You're migrating. Plans to migrate. All right.
No, most of the Indians now migrated to US and getting citizenship there, Canada.
Absolutely, sir. Now, in the next session, we'll be having Anil Malhotra, sir. He'll be dealing with the topic intercaste or interreligious marriages, and that will be on Saturday, 20th at 4:30. So, sir, as we come to the end of the 179th session, Thank you very much, Professor Sir, for that wonderful exposition of this nuances of this law, which we were thoroughly unaware of. And thank you, Justice Ramkumar Sir and Justice Ramakrishnan Sir, for your valuable presence and inputs, and all of you for being part and parcel of this interactive session. I'm sure that we have spent this afternoon on a good cause, and we are all going home empowered and enlightened. And till we meet again next Saturday, please do take care and stay safe.